Well, I'm signed into. Are we doing this? Is this audio as well as, or do you want me? Do you want me in vision as well?
Well, we can have it in vision. We'd keep our video on, and then I suppose
Yeah, sure.
if
No, I
it's
just meant for recording because
yeah.
I'm just really conscious. I've got a tangle of headphones here. I borrowed one of my daughter's bits of kit here. So,
Yeah,
um,
it sounds all right.
yeah, yeah. No, I've got a proper mic. I've got a proper microphone and everything. I've just got the just the if I'm in vision, I'll spend 2 minutes untangling this bit of spaghetti. But if I'm not, then fine.
Yeah, that's fine. So Josh has written all the questions.
Excellent.
I'll just read them basically how he's written them.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
And then if he's got anything to add along the way, he'll pipe up.
Cool. Josh, thank you so much for this. Delighted to do this. I'm very grateful for your interest.
He said if he's got anything wrong, just shout at
him. Yes.
Okay, right. So let's get going. Josh's first question. My first recollections of you was on cultural documentaries of the early noughties. How did these documentaries capture the mood of the time?
Wow, now I feel like a historical exhibit here. Tracking myself back to my origins. How did they reflect the time? Well, that's an interesting question, because I think if we're talking about, I don't know, one of the first things I did in television was the Culture Show, which was a kind of magazine program that would get to grips with whatever was going on at that moment right now. So we were always trying, I suppose, to capture something that was in the atmosphere, to try and work out what was happening with a very broad definition of culture. I can remember doing a film for them on etiquette and things like that. So actually, I've never really looked back at any of that stuff, but I imagine that sufficient time has elapsed now for that to form quite a good little time capsule of the early noughties. And I wonder what we would think of ourselves. Maybe we were a bit smug. I'm not sure. I can remember maybe we took ourselves too seriously. But it was the kind of show where you would be doing like a piece to camera in a field or something like that. So it's something I can't quite answer, because I think in a way, you do this work and then you don't really get to see it again. These days, I suppose things stay in circulation the longest, but stuff from the early noughties has kind of dropped down a bit of a hole in the back of the sofa. Really, I never see that. The thing I see most often, actually, from that period is a series I did on the history of hotels for Channel 4, and Channel 4 kept that going, repeated that so often that people thought I'd made about 20 series of that, but they used to just stick it on if there was a gap between the John Mills film and Countdown. That's become a time capsule for me personally.
Yeah. So talking about sort of reflection and those kind of things, in 2012 you took part in the documentary The Many Faces of Ronnie Barker, which took an honest look at his life and career. How do you think the comedy landscape would have looked like if he had not retired so early?
Well, so that's a good question, because in a way, it's he went too soon, didn't he? But at the very end of his career, he clearly wasn't finding comic material that was quite good enough for him, was he? He did all those his own show, of course, with Ronnie Corbett, and he did Porridge and its sequel. But do you remember there was the very last thing he did as a sitcom performer was something called The Magnificent Evans, which was a series about a photographer in the Welsh valleys. And it was just not very good. And I wonder whether, in a way, his decision to disappear at that point might have been quite a wise one. We'll never know, will we? There's one a parallel universe where he stayed on and people wrote really great things for him. But there might be an even worse one where he kept going with substandard material, or material that wasn't really suited to him. But what I really think that we genuinely missed, and I think he didn't do this because he perhaps wasn't confident enough about his own abilities, or he just wasn't that, he had nothing to prove, was like a bigger dramatic element to the end of his career. I mean, can you imagine like what Ronnie Barker doing Beckett would have been like? That would have been fantastic.
Yeah. Yeah. He did the Gathering Storm. Did the Gathering Storm?
The Gathering Storm, absolutely. I mean, we could have had loads more of those, couldn't we? Because he's great in that, isn't he? As Churchill's butler. Um, but he was very choosy, and maybe he just got fed up of it all. You know, maybe he just thought he'd done enough and decided he wanted to just sit down for a bit. I don't know whether he was that ambitious in a strange kind of way. It's odd, isn't it? We have these desires about the careers of people that might not always meet with their own feelings about themselves. You know, there are all kinds of people I wish had had these this sort of late period. You know, Ken Dodd went on performing till the very end, but I mean, wouldn't it have been great to see him in more dramatic roles? But people don't always do what you what you as a viewer want them to do.
Yeah. So back to sort of your career then, it's fair to say, or is it fair to say, I suppose, that you first came to prominence as a TV critic in The Independent?
Well, I got my first gig in journalism at The Independent. Yeah, I was a student then, really, and I went to open the Post, and I was doing my DPhil at that time, so I still had a bit of the funding from that, which meant that I sort of had a little bit of money to live on, which meant that I could do unpaid work experience there. So I went to open the Post, and you know, at the end of a couple of weeks there, I managed to get a commission or two. And it's just that that thing. If you just sort of sit there in somebody's eye line when they're in the middle of a crisis and they need something doing, sometimes they'll point at you and say, "Well, can you do that?" And you'll say yes. So that's what it was really. So I went there to open the Post, and by the time I left there, which was probably kind of a good a good 7 years of my life, I felt like I'd done every job on the paper, and it was also, I think, partly because the paper wasn't lavishly funded. It was struggling rather. So anybody who was keen and cheap, they were willing to hear from.
How did sort of like a respectable broadsheet, I suppose, view the arts during that time?
Well, it covered them well, I think. It gave, when I think back to the kinds of things that we used to be asked to do for those pages, you know, interviews with quite kind of serious film directors, quite abstruse subjects sometimes. I look back and I think that would be a really hard. There was a little bit more money, so you would actually be sent out to report on something. I think one of the difficulties of arts journalism now, I mean, particularly now when we're all living this odd life, is being able to get out there and report on it. So there was space and time to do that, and you know, they would kind of say yes to things that now I think would be harder to pitch to a paper.
Yeah. People like Gillian Reynolds, Eve Pollard, Polly Toynbee, they're some of the pioneers of entertainment journalism. How important do you think these figures are in the development of UK entertainment journalism?
Well, I think that, I mean, it goes way back before those great figures who you've mentioned. One of my biggest influences was a woman called Narina Shute, who I got to know when she was in her 90s, and she had been the gossip columnist on Film Weekly magazine in the late 20s. You know, still in the silent period. And I used to go around to talk to her about all of these people who had been, had been dead for decades, and nobody remembered who they were almost. And she told me about her times, sneaking around the film studios and doing things like Alfred. She said Alfred Hitchcock had banned her from the set, and she'd snook back on in disguise. This kind of thing, and actually, she was the person who I think I took the most guidance from. And she had this very clever technique of, if she was going to say something rude about somebody, she would always slip in a compliment at the same time. So she would say that, for instance, a character actress of the period had a face like a delicious loaf of bread. Not a face like a loaf of bread, a face like a delicious loaf of bread. And it was those kind of things that, that kind of thing made a big impression on me, really. And she was great. So people have been writing about the arts and about cinema in quite a sophisticated way, I think, for a very long time.
Yeah. As an author, you've created a repertoire of work surrounding all aspects of film and television. Josh wanted to talk to you about your 2006 book, Doctor Who: Circular Time. Why do you think that period of Doctor Who remains so special?
Now that's not by me, that Circular Time.
He's messed that up. Sorry.
That's the mistake, Josh. That's the test, isn't it? That's the deliberate mistake. Yeah.
Yeah, it's due one. Yeah, we'll cut that bit out. So, silent films, they're something that are special to you as well?
So, are there silent films that are special to me? Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I'm really grateful for is that I managed to get Faber to be interested in publishing a book about the early history of British cinema. At what felt like the very last moment it was possible to do that, whilst there were still people alive who could give you their first-hand experiences of it. And so that was really the first couple of years of this century that I was writing that. So I was able to talk to people who had been in silent films, even to talk to people who'd been in films as far back as like 1912, 1913, which seems absolutely impossible, doesn't it? But I was able to speak to that tiny group of people who were then in their late 90s or just the other side of 100 in some of those cases, and get that really very spooky experience of reaching so far back in time through somebody's experience. I remember talking to a film star called Joan Morgan, who was a star in the teens and the 20s, and she made an adaptation of her father, made an adaptation of Thomas Hardy's The Mayor of Casterbridge, for which Thomas Hardy came on location with them. So, there you are sitting in a room with somebody who can reach back all of those years to their memory of talking to one of the great Victorian novelists. And at moments like that, the deep past feels just within your grasp almost. So those kind of experiences I kind of crave, really.
So I want to ask you about BBC Radio 3's Free Thinking. Well, sort of discusses hard-hitting issues and things like that. How important do you think it is for programs to tackle controversial subjects and talk about things on radio?
Well, I think one of the good things about this program is that you can really talk about anything you want to on it. Really, we cover all kinds of stuff. So we might do a program on Finnegan's Wake, notoriously the most difficult novel in the language, and then the next week we might do a program about the Goodies, and we'll treat both of them with the same kind of seriousness and the same kind of intensity, really. But we'll also hopefully enjoy ourselves doing both of those things. So I think with Free Thinking, one of the things that I think is really important that we try to live up to the name of it. And if you've got that title in the Radio Times each week, then it does make you think, well, what haven't we done, or how could we approach this question, or how can we tackle things that are, because we've got quite a lot of time, how can we tackle things in a bit more depth, or from a different kind of angle? I mean, some of the things that we discuss are the things that you might hear discussed on the news channel or on the Today program, but we try and investigate the ideas behind the story. So hopefully we're kind of fleshing things out a bit, putting them in their historical context, that kind of thing. And for me, it's rather like never really leaving university, because all the time there's like a pile of books to read, and people who I need to kind of do my homework in order not to look an idiot in front of when I talk to them. And it's yeah, it keeps you on your toes, really.
Yeah. So obviously you've had a few other radio ventures, sort of things like Memoirs of the Space Woman and
Oh wow, yeah, that was good. I enjoyed that. Yeah.
yeah. How do you sort of maintain momentum when you're through radio?
Well, it's just a matter of you're always having to come up with new ideas, and then you have to try and get them onto the air. Now, if it's something that can go onto free thinking, that's a slightly more streamlined process, because there's a group of us who all the time are trying to come up with subjects for discussion. But if you want to do something a bit more elaborate than a kind of round table discussion, then you have to pitch it. You have to get somebody to agree to let you do it and to fund it. For me as a presenter, you have to find a producer who wants to make something with you, and so that's and sometimes it's frustrating because the commissioner will not share your enthusiasm for a subject, and sometimes they do. So there's that sort of process goes on all the time, really. um it can be a bit, it can be a bit exhausting, but the thing is that if you have a good idea, it'll find its way out in some form, even if the controller of a station doesn't say yes, absolutely, I want an hour on it in 2 weeks time.
Yeah.
There'll be space for it somewhere else. It'll, once you've latched onto something, it's never, nothing really, nothing's a waste of time. It all finds a home eventually.
Yeah. So looking back over your career, what do you think your proudest achievement is?
I don't know, really. I find it hard to even think of myself as somebody who has um, a career, because there's been so little structure to it. For me, it feels like it might, if you look at it, it might look like to you it has some sort of shape to it. To me, it's just like it's like it's just kind of stumbling from one gig to another. They're very kind of everything's a one-off in a funny kind of way.
Yeah.
But I think that the thing that satisfies me the most, really, is when you can share something with an audience, who then respond to it. I mean, one of one of the things I really like doing the most is the film music program I do on Radio 3. Not just because I can sort of sit there and talking to film composers, or kind of talking away to myself in this studio, um, and playing the music, but it's the relationship with the listeners, and it's really blown me away, really. I can kind of trail a question about what they think should be on next week's show, and we can get hundreds of responses. And what's good about it is that it shows that there would have been a time when you would have had to argue quite strongly that film music is serious enough to devote this kind of attention to. Nobody really did pay it much attention until relatively recently. And when Radio 3 did a big season of film music, a few years ago, there was quite a lot of resistance to it. A lot of people said, "Oh, why are you doing this? You know, this isn't music. Um, this is sort of this is kind of incidental music, or this is sort of too this doesn't have a life beyond the experience of watching it in the cinema." But I don't think people make that argument anymore. And I say one thing that really delights me is there's this big community of people who I'm now kind of plugged into who feel the same way.
Yeah, excellent. So what's next for Matthew Sweet? What have you got coming up, and have you got any other projects or anything at the same time as the radio?
Yeah, well, I'm always on the lookout for things. Are in a weird kind of hiatus now. I should be in Vietnam at the moment, where I have had a project set up there for the summer. A gallery installation that was a sort of had a kind of history dimension to it, but which was a project about about radio during the war in Vietnam. And I'd been out there and I'd interviewed people who were involved, and together with a Vietnamese sound artist called Nung Nguyen and a British filmmaker called Esther Johnson, we were making this gallery piece, which would have filled your head with all of these strange kind of radio artifacts, and there's images to go with it, and it's going to happen, but like next year, we hope. So that's what that's what I should be doing now. And I've got really into having visiting it to give some talks there. I've got become deeply interested in all things Vietnamese. So I've got a couple of other things I'd like to pursue there, sort of history projects, really, looking back to the 60s and 70s. But who knows? I mean, there are no. You can't fly to Vietnam right now, and even if I could get there, even if I walked there, I would have to quarantine for 14 days. So everything is on hold at the moment.
A little bit. Sounds fascinating.
Mm.
Okay, that's all the questions that Josh has got for you. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Josh.
Let you know when it's going to go up.
Absolutely, yeah, do.
And then,
thank you.
No, yeah, really appreciate your time. And
not at all.
Have a lovely rest of your day.
Yeah, my pleasure. Good luck with it. Thanks very much, Josh.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.